Alrighty, so now we get to one of my favorite things in all of Python, the for loop. How's that for nerdy, having a favorite structure in a programming language? So I love the for loop because it is different than what you see for loops used for in most other languages. And it makes so much more sense to me anyway, the way that we use for loops in Python. Now you can do a for loop similar to the way you do a for loop in other languages, but in Python typically we use for loops for what we call iterables, or iteration. And so I have two iterable values here, and not every variable type is iterable, and I'll explain that in a minute. But so if I were to just print x and print y, in this case, I am going to get, it's going to print out this string, hello, it's nice to see you. And then I created this big long list, and this big long list was a list of items in X, because I used, if hopefully you watched the video on string methods, I created a list of items that came from the X. All right, so I have both of these, and both lists and strings are iterable. And again, I'll explain what is and isn't iterable in a few minutes. But they mean that by being iterable, we can do our special little type of for loop in Python. So, you know, you're used to seeing, if you're coming from another language, a for loop being sort of a counter where you do things a certain number of times is one of the most common uses of it. But and sometimes you even use it to iterate through like controls on a form or something like that. And that's more like what we do in Python. But in Python, there's a special way we can treat an iterable value. So I can make up a temporary value, and I'm going to call my temporary value items. Think of that as a variable, a temporary variable. And then I use the in keyword, and then I give it an iterable value. And iterable values are strings, lists, tuples, dictionaries, but not integers, floats, booleans. I don't think sets are iterable, to be honest with you. I'm pretty sure a set's not iterable, but we'll test that. I don't use sets a lot, to be totally honest with you. I use lists for most things. So we say for items in X, print items. All right, simple. So what this is saying is iterate through X and print out every individual item. So X is the value as a whole, and items is a placeholder for the individual iterable values. So the iterable values in a string are the individual characters in a string. The iterable values in a list are the individual values in the list. So if I run this, I get my text, hello, it's nice to see you. And ironically, because I created a list out of my out of this same value, it's going to look pretty similar. Actually, it's going to look really similar. Look identical. So I'm going to give it, let's say it's a different list. It can be a list of numbers. And so on. And it's really nice because in most languages, if we want to iterate through a list or some structure like that, first thing we got to do is figure out how long it is. We don't have to do that in Python. Python does that for us. Python just goes through the list until there's nothing left to go through. And we don't just have to print them out. I mean, obviously printing them out is very limiting. We can do all sorts of things. Like we could say, we could create a value z equals z plus items. All right, and then when we're all done, oops, we will say print z. So yeah, I blew that. I forgot. We gotta set z equal to 0 before we start that. So if I run this module now, what I got was the sum of those items. So it iterated through, and after each one, it added the sum. And keep in mind that just sort of like using, sort of like when you declare a function that has parameters, that parameter value up there is sort of the placeholder for what gets passed to it. It's the same thing here. So let's do this. I'm going to do, and this is something called, and actually I demonstrated in an earlier video, if you actually watched it, which a lot of you didn't, something called list comprehensions. List comprehensions are kind of like this. All right, so that is going to create me a list of numbers from 1 to 45. And let's make sure I did it right. Well, what did I do? Oh, items for items. Whoops, I totally typed that wrong. Items for items in range 1 to 45. I did it again. I deleted my Z, didn't I? Okay, so that created me a list. And just to prove that that created me a list, I'm going to just do print y. Okay, so that's my list. It's from 1 to 44. It goes one lower than that. So if you add up all the numbers from 1 to 44, you get 990, because that's basically what that did. Now, but we can do more with it. I could say, and here I'm going to hit on something that you may or may not know, but I'm going to say if items mod 7 equals 0, print items. And we don't need this. So what's that going to do? Okay. What that's going to do is that's going to print out all of the items in Y that are evenly divisible by 7. If you don't understand why, don't worry about it. Not that important. But so 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, and 42. So I can do anything with that individual iterable item there. And it's awesome. It is so much better than having to determine the length of a control or a list or an array or whatever you want to call it, and then go through the list one at a time and all that. It just does it for you. It is so awesome. So that is what we use the for loop for most in Python. So I've shown you that that strings are iterable. You can iterate through the individual items. Lists are iterable. Tuples are iterable. Dictionaries are iterable. Although there's a little trick to that, and I'm going to talk about that when we get to dictionaries. And like I said, I do not believe, and this is one of those things I don't do this every single day, to be honest with you. During the part of the year I'm not teaching Python, I do write a little bit, but I don't sit there and write a lot of Python every day. So let's just create a set and that, and I'm going to say for items in Z, print items. Let's see if that will iterate. Ah, look at that. I was wrong. Sets are iterable. There you go. So sets are iterable. Some values are not. Yeah, you cannot iterate an integer, you cannot iterate a float, you cannot iterate a Boolean, but you can iterate lists, tuples, and all that kind of stuff. Now, let me show you one more thing that we can do with iteration. And we call this unpacking. And you will see this a lot. This is similar to what you would do when you're iterating through a dictionary. Like I said, I'll cover that later. But let's say that y is actually... And you see this a lot in tuples. And let's say I have a tuple that is, we'll say it's a set of coordinates. And it's actually a tuple that contains tuples. Oops. And let's say that, like I said, these are just like x, y. And this items, I use the word items a lot, but you can use any variable you want here. It's just a variable name, just like anything else. You could call it kangaroos for all it matters. And so I'm going to say for x coord and y coord, because we're pretending these are x and y coordinates, in y, print x coord print y coord, and you will see that it actually prints them all out. And actually what would have made a whole lot more sense, and I don't know why I didn't do it this way, would be if we did, oh, I know why I didn't do it, because it would have looked funny. I mean, it's not going to look any different. It's like I'm iterating through the list. That's why I didn't do it. But so you can even address the individual coordinates. So you can unpack it. When you have, if this was three tuples that were in sets of 3, I could have x, y, and z coordinates or whatever. So not only can you access a single iterable value, but if you have an iterable within an iterable, you could access those. So in other words, if I don't know, this may not work. Let's see if that works. Yeah, okay. So now I will warn you that if you're going to unpack, they have to match. If I try to unpack this, I'm going to get a value error because it couldn't unpack that. All right, so that's unpacking. That is iterating using for loops. Between the videos you watched last time, hopefully, and the videos today, you should be able to do today's assignment really easily. All right, have a good day.